That's right.
Okay, I finally got the couple of pictures I wanted to show during this webinar. I think at the right size. So let's begin. Welcome everybody. We have a good hour. I said an hour, but we can run over 10 or 15 minutes. I don't think that would hurt anything. I'm just going to read the introductions I'm going to make of Ghada Karmi and Ramzy Baroud. So I'll just be reading a couple of things right now. Welcome to both of you. This webinar is being offered by the organization One Democratic State in Palestine, UK, a nonprofit founded in 2013 and registered in England. Its purpose is to make the idea of one democratic state, or ODS, better known, mainly in Western Europe and the US. We want to argue for it as part of our efforts to get our governments to change course. Now here is our, this is our website address, our email address, and for Facebook, just search in Facebook for One Democratic State in Palestine, UK. Okay. Oh, right, stop. I'm sorry, this is the first time I've ever done this. It's going to be a little bit awkward. My name is Blake Alcott, and I'm the director of this NGO. Please write us if you want to get in touch, and in particular, if you have comments or questions arising from this webinar, or put them in the chat at the bottom of your screens during the webinar. We will deal with all of them on our website and hopefully in a follow-up webinar in October. I'm not sure who can participate, maybe Ramzy and Ghada or other people to deal with the questions and comments. Okay, now I'm going to introduce Ghada. She was born in Jerusalem and fled with her family via Damascus to London, where her father worked with the BBC Arabic service for many years thereafter, after 1948. She received her degree as a medical doctor from the University of Bristol and became increasingly active in working for Palestinian liberation. In 1997, she wrote a seminal article on One Democratic State for Chatham House, and in 2007 published her book explicitly on the ODS solution, titled Married to Another Man. Now I want to show you that, there we go, the book cover. In 2009, she and Ilan Pape founded the European Center for Palestine Studies at Exeter University. Her two autobiographical books are the 2002 In Search of Fatima, I'll have a screenshot of this a bit later, and the 2015 Return. She writes for The Guardian, Middle East Eye, the London Review of Books, and other media, and lives in London and Amman. Okay. Right. And now I will introduce Ramzy. Ramzy Baroud was born in the Nusayrat refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, where his family landed after being expelled from Beit Daras, a town about 30 kilometers from Gaza in 1948. He started at a young age working as a journalist, in 1999 founding the Palestine Chronicle, now going strong in its 22nd year. It's an online newspaper analysis place. He has often worked for the Middle East Eye and Al Jazeera and has written 5 books. One appeared in 2010, the semi-autobiographical My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, Gaza's Untold Story. Right. Yeah, here it is. Another is The Last Earth, a Palestinian Story, which came out in 2018. His latest is These Chains Will Be Broken: Palestinian Stories of Struggle and Defiance in Israeli Prisons. He is now editing with Ilan Pape a collection of essays with the title Our Vision for Liberation: Engaged Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out. One of them, by the way, one of the essayists is Ghada Karmi. Ramzy received his PhD from Exeter University in 2015 and now lives in Seattle. Okay, those are the introductions. Now, to start off, would each of you please say something about ODS, a description or an analysis, or just how you see this vision or this solution in your own words? Is that okay? And who wants to start?
Ramzy? Ramzy, would you like
to
Ramzy.
Okay.
Sorry, I unmuted myself. Ghada, if you could kind of start, and I mean, you've written much more extensively about this issue than I have.
Okay, all right, that's fine. First of all, hello to everyone, and it's a very great privilege to be able to talk about this extremely important topic and try at least to disseminate the message as widely and as far as we can. Because you see, in my view, there really is only one way forward for the terrible tragedy that befell the Palestinians. There is only one way forward, and that is to regain their former country, the country of Palestine. That is the only just resolution to this awful calamity. And how would one do that? Well, there is only one way. Again, the one way is by replacing the current state of Israel, which is ruling Palestine, and replacing it with a state, a democratic state, which includes the citizenry of Palestinian Arabs, currently Jewish Israelis, and Palestinians everywhere where they have been dispersed, and their descendants. That really is the only way forward. I hope that later in this webinar, we will be talking more in depth about this, but I want to give way to Ramzy to say what he feels about this.
Right. Thank you for that, Ghada, and thank you, Blake, and to all of your participants for being part of this conversation. I do not have the kind of experience that Ghada has, neither in this particular subject nor in the overall history of it. But that said, I must say that I've struggled personally with the issue of the, not the issue of the one state per se, but with what type of compromises does it actually entail? Number one, the main problem I've had is who is entitled to have that conversation in the first place? Those who are living on the ground and fighting the good fight and digging their way out of prison cells using rusty spoons, and are under siege in Gaza and living behind apartheid walls, or activists and intellectuals outside Palestine. And it's not my way of undermining our role that we play as Palestinians or pro-Palestinian activists and intellectuals based in other parts of the world, but I think as Palestinians we have learned to mistrust this kind of superimposed solutions on the Palestinian people. Oslo has taught us an extremely painful lesson of how when people get together, whether in Tunisia or in Oslo or in Madrid or in Geneva or what have you, and come up with solutions without having an actual connection to people on the ground, then you are going to have a problem here. You are going to have some sort of a, what Antonio Gramsci refers to as intellectualism, which is the idea of ideas being developed and evolved separate from the body politic that truly matters. So this is really was the issue that I've had. But now, the reason that I feel that it is really time to start talking about it is because, number one, the political leadership in Ramallah is completely bankrupt. It has absolutely nothing to offer whatsoever. And number two is because there's this stagnation in the Palestinian strategy, because Palestinians who are capable of offering ideas are either in prison, marginalized, assassinated, and so forth. So for me, a compromise would be for us to have this conversation, but certainly in connection with a larger body politic, the one that truly matters, and those are the Palestinian people living under occupation in Palestine, but also Palestinian communities in South Lebanon, in Syria, and all around the world. So my comments is really kind of trying to answer the question. Yes, of course, I fully agree with what Ghada said, but the question is, who is the legitimate party that is capable of advancing these ideas in order for these ideas to be different from the various sets of ideas presented by Oslo, the Madrid negotiations, and so forth.
Would you like to reply to that, Ghada?
Yeah, I mean, of course, you're right, Ramzy. You're right you've moved on a stage quite rightly from what I said. I was talking about a principle, about what we would strive for, what we would aim for, and you quite rightly have moved on to who is going to be talking about this, who are the legitimate actors in all this. And of course, I totally agree with you. One of our problems, has been, as Palestinians, has been the fragmentation of the Palestinian people. As a result of that, there has been a tendency, which is totally understandable, for each group or community or whatever to come up with certain ideas. Now, of course, that doesn't work if you have a national aim, if you are looking at putting this thing right. You actually have to have a unified vision. And the way you do that is by engaging all those groupings, inside, outside. But having said that, again, I want to move it forward a bit, which is I've always been convinced that, desirable as this aim is, that we are all united and we're all aiming at the same thing, the real work for this is going to come from people on the ground. However much I or you or many people like us think and work and in fact breathe the issue of Palestine, the people who are going to make it happen are on the ground. They are the ones in daily contact with the enemy. They are the ones who know what it means to live that sort of life, and they will be the ones to get us out of it. So it may be that one of the strategies we need to discuss is that once we're all agreed on the principle, then when implementing it, we need to have a clear division between the people inside and the people outside, and the roles of each towards that common aim.
Could I put it this way, maybe, that those of us on the other side, non-Palestinians like myself, our job is to put pressure on our governments who are supporting the Zionist state. And that's a division of labor. That's the way I see it anyway. And the people on the inside in the 48 or 67 occupied territories have their own job, and it's much harder, much more dangerous. And yeah, but Ramzy, a question, did you actually use the word election, that there could be an election, or did I misunderstand you? To find out, people from Palestinians, what are their political preferences?
Right. No, I haven't used the term elections. In fact, I'm a bit wary of the concept of elections under occupation to begin with, but that we could talk about this later if you wish.
Okay. No, I just wanted to, it's so hard looking at it from the outside to form an opinion of what a majority of Palestinians think on this issue. Nobody polls all of them at once, ever.
But the information are indeed available, Blake. We do have glimpses on what Palestinians think. I'm looking here at a recent poll. Okay, I mean, I know the Washington Institute for Near East Policy is not the most credible platform.
I've seen that, yeah.
Yes, but the idea itself, I mean, the numbers that it produced in July of this year, really more or less with other numbers that have been produced by more credible and more trustworthy intellectual platforms. But it really says more or less that majority of Palestinians and, or rather, sorry, the minority now among Palestinians and Israelis believe that a two-state solution possible, although of course they are both coming from two different perspectives and have two different spin on this. But also the majority of Palestinians believe that an ideal solution would be a Palestine from the river to the sea. The disagreement lies in this. Not like second to that. So you have a majority of Palestinians believe that a free Palestine from the river to the sea is an ideal solution, but a secondary number believes that a shared Palestine from the river to the sea is an ideal solution, which means that there is this caveat, there is this margin of people who still believe in the idea of a completely independent and free Palestine. You know, back in the kind of the 1948 or the post-1948 kind of imagination of what a free Palestine would look like. But either way, it seems that we are at that cusp, we are at that historical transition where the majority of Palestinians more or less leaning that way. And I think it's very important, what do we do with these numbers? And this is why I emphasized from the very beginning the idea of engagement. And this is why the title of the book in which Ghada is taking part of is Engaged Palestinian Intellectuals, because we want to engage this mass. Because a lot of these people, yes, believe in that to be the ideal solution, but they also have a problem that they don't think it's possible. So how do we make it possible? And how do we work with them to turn these numbers into an actual political reality on the ground?
Yeah. And I tell you, but of course, we mustn't forget that there is a real problem here. The question of the two-state solution, unfortunately, has acquired has penetrated people in a way that it's affected them emotionally. Many Palestinians really want the idea of an independent state with them in it. No Jewish Israelis, just them, for them, with their own flag, where they can feel free, all the rest of it. This goes very deep. And, you know, I've always said the proponents of the two-state solution, the people who kept it going and who supported it, are in a sense criminals, because if you encourage ideas in people towards something where you have no intention of making it happen, then that is a criminal act. And what I think has happened, and we mustn't underestimate it, is the number of ordinary Palestinians, especially the ones living under occupation, how much they long for the idea of an independent state. And not only them, but the intelligentsia, many of whom have bought into the idea that it's not possible to think of any other way forward. That that's about the maximum we can get now from international consensus. We've got the international community on our side, at least for this two-state idea. So we need to go along with that. Don't let's disrupt that and start talking about something that nobody is officially is supporting.
Okay.
It's very pernicious.
But these, the people you're talking about, when they imagine the purely Palestinian state, of course, it's on that approximately at most 20% of Palestine. It's a two-state framework.
Of course. But the problem is, you see, the idea has become entrenched. First, that it's the most you can hope for.
Right.
You know how when you've got a starving person, you get them used to a crumb. When you give them 2 crumbs, they think, oh, well, that's not bad, you know. So it's the most they can hope for. So that's entrenched. Now then, little as it is, yes, 20%, though it might be, nevertheless, at least we can be independent, we can have our flag, all this kind of thing.
Should we,
I want to agree with Ghada regarding the entrenched principle here. But I want to challenge the notion a little bit by saying that over time, it's not really as entrenched as it used to be. And I'll tell you why. I remember in 1988, when the PLO declared a Palestinian state from Algiers. And I remember I was watching that on TV as a teenager, and my mom and my dad were there, and we had a big, color TV, so many of the neighbors were there as well. And I just remember the tears, I remember the hugs, I remember the, chants of Allahu Akbar, God is great. It felt like indeed we are finally at that stage when we start, it's the process of reclaiming something that we have yearned for such a long time. And I think that explains a great deal about when the early stages of the Oslo process was being implemented, the soldiers arriving with PLO uniforms and Palestinian flags on their uniforms, and how, and I was there for that scene as well, hundreds of thousands of people went dancing and singing in the streets and waiting at the highway near Rafah for Yasser Arafat and the cadre of the Palestinian of Fatah and the PLO to arrive. And I think around that stage, I would say 1988, 1993, perhaps all the way until the second Intifada, that's when I feel like that generation began realizing not that there are alternative solutions, but that they have been lied to. I think that's when we start seeing cracks in that entrenched idea that this is absolutely the only way. Whenever, I think it's in September when Mahmoud Abbas goes to the United Nations and use it as a stage for grandstanding and declares his intention to make a Palestinian state a reality. I remember in the beginning when he used to do this annual pilgrimage to New York, and how there was a degree of enthusiasm among ordinary Palestinians. But if you, for example, look at his speeches from the last year and the previous year, the way that the media covered it, I'm talking about Palestinian media, the way that the Palestinian street interacted with it, people are not convinced anymore. I think the notion of the two-state solution that made my neighbors cry in 1988 is not the same one that exists today. But that doesn't mean that we have replaced that with a new idea. And there's this entrenched one-state solution that making people all emotional and happy and excited. I think we are in this vacuum. There's a transition in which we feel we have been lied to. This is not going to happen. It would be nice if it does, but we don't think it will, but we don't know what is the alternative. So I'm not making the argument that we are ready now for a one state. I am saying that the Palestinian people are ready for new thinking, new strategies, and new ideas.
That was one of the things I wanted to ask you later, was how do each of you respond to Palestinians who still support the two-state solution? What do you say to them? You've described very well how emotional it was and how some other people think that's the most we can ever get, okay? But Could we put that off a little bit till later? Is that okay? Because we advertise this as a sort of ODS for beginners, or just to get the basic concepts out. And I would like to take some time right now to analyze the Munich Declaration, if that's okay. This is a document stating on one piece of A4 paper, stating 10 principles describing what one democratic state would look like, sort of in constitutional terms. It's a sort of a rough skeleton for a constitution. And it's the basic document of our NGO, and it was written mainly by Samir Abed-Rabo from Texas in Munich in 2012. That's why it's called Munich Declaration. You and I were there, Ghada. And it's very similar to something written in 2007 by the so-called London Group. At that time, ODS supporters had meetings in Madrid and London and wrote something also very concise, and it's much the same message. I mean, I don't see any contradictions between them. And it's also very similar to something that's come out in the last couple of years from the ODS campaign. And that's a separate group. It's not a campaign in the sense of just a broad initiative. It's a group of people on the ground. Well, they're based basically in Palestine and trying to organize there for ODS. And I think it was just this year or last year, they put out a so-called manifesto with a 10-point program. And this is also very similar to the London Group statement, to the Munich Declaration. And there have been other statements over the years. Now, what I would like to do is just, again, for the ABCs of what ODS really. Okay, good. Okay, really sorry about that. How do why does this keep, oh, okay. Right, I'm really sorry about that. I just sort of summarized it for myself in 9 points. I'll try to say them quickly. One state, of course, that's obvious, it's reunification or departition. Palestine has been departitioned officially since 1947, as we all know. The state would uphold basic human rights. That's the first thing. You could take the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, for instance, or bills of rights, bills of rights from other constitutions. And also there's the familiar principle that everybody is equal before the law. There's no privilege for anybody based on ethnicity or gender or religion. And within this framework of equality of all citizens and respect for human rights, you just have a bog standard majority rule type of democracy, probably with a parliament. The protection of minorities, which is an important issue when we're talking about one unified state, would happen through the individual rights of free expression and free association. That is, the Munich Declarations, for instance, makes no mention of collective rights defined in terms of ethnicity or religion or language. The right of return. This is a huge point. The right of return is for ODS, I think for all groups that identify with ODS, because we're by no means the only one. It's a non-negotiable part of ODS. All of the approximately 7 million Palestinians living in exile outside Palestine who are prevented by Israel from returning to their places of origin have, in fact, ethically and in international law as well, they actually have that right to return. It's a right that they actually have. It's just not realized. Like most right of return groups, and like BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, we orient this point around UN General Assembly Resolution 194 of the 11th of December, 1948. So that's also well worth reading. Point 7 is that this solution would obviously fulfill the demand for Palestinian self-determination, but in all of Palestine, not just on one side of the Green Line. The 8th point is that the citizens, as Ghada said earlier, would be all Palestinians and all Jewish Israelis now living in Palestine. Now, that is, it's not just the Palestinians or the people residing between the river and the sea, but it's also those in exile. Now, what might be controversial here is that would Palestinians who choose not to return to Palestine, would they also still be citizens? Or would there be some special way of taking these people into account, getting them on board? Because if you think back, they or their ancestors were citizens of Mandate Palestine in 1948 when they were expelled, or in 1967, or the ongoing expulsion. So they have this sort of latent right to citizenship in Palestine, as John Quigley puts it. It's a sort of a latent citizenship. Okay, now the last point is property. As far as I know, about 94% of Palestine was in Palestinian, also non-Zionist possession in 1947. So to my knowledge, all ODS statements are adamant that this property, once again, belongs to the Palestinians, either collectively or families and their descendants. Okay, is there anything that either of you would like to say to that little sort of summary? Because the purpose of this, I say, is if there's somebody who doesn't know what ODS is, you know, the basics of it, I just wanted to give that as a sort of 9. You can, of course, go to our website or a lot of other websites and read the Munich Declaration or the London Statement or the ODS campaign manifesto, and it's all there. So would either of you like to say anything about that, sort of the nuts and bolts?
Well, look, I mean, what you're setting out there are the principles of a liberal democratic state, which I think we would all agree with. Obviously, when you get down to some of the detail of how you implement certain things, that can follow on. But as a statement of on what basis this state would be set up, seems to me to be perfectly reasonable. There's nothing there that one would not expect. And your point about citizenship, you know, you have the model of expatriate Britons, let's say, British people who don't live in Britain, but that doesn't mean they give up their citizenship, certainly not. And so, and by the way, that brings me to another observation, which is that some people have said, you know, that many Palestinians would not in fact return physically because they've, and you can understand it, they've built lives elsewhere, they have children, they have grandchildren, you know, it's, but the answer to that, of course, is that they have the right to do so if they wish it. So these are not objections at all. These are just exactly what should be happening.
Absolutely, Ghada. I mean, they are indeed, I can't imagine really a major point of disagreement on, you know, people obtaining basic human rights or having all equal citizenship and that sort of thing. And of course, some of these points are tailored specifically to fit the uniqueness of the Palestinian situation. You know, point 6, right of return, self-determination, 7, citizenship, residents and refugees, etc., and property restoration. But of course, I mean, this is the ideal. And I think this is, I would say that even the various one-state groups that, even if they don't work together, I think really more or less they are going to find themselves having, you know, in a point of agreement over these, more or less these same points. And I think, of course, the challenge is how do we turn these basic principles and this foundation, this idealistic foundation of a shared future into a reality on the ground, and especially once we are hit with the walls of reality and the walls of balances of power and the walls of, and it is a legitimate idea, the fact that you do not have one, as of yet, one single official state or official entity that agrees and embraces the one state solution. So these are really the things that we will have to deal with in the future.
You're talking about some state, let's say Ireland or Bolivia, or some state that simply Malaysia, that came out and said, we renounced the two-state thing. We're for one democratic state. Is that what you're sort of imagining?
That's something to that extent. And the reason that you don't have that, and I think you would have that, shall the Palestinian leadership itself change its course. And once they change course, we have already enough camaraderie, solidarity, brotherly and sisterly relations with so many other states that I am sure that we will have an initial number of states that would at least alter their position instead of having this constant position being parroted in favor of a two-state, at least finding themselves in a situation where they would say, while we acknowledge international law as far as these issues are concerned, we also support our sisters and brothers in Palestine, and we would support whatever national aspirations they have. And you could start having kind of a wiggle room for that conversation. Right now, you don't, simply because you don't have not only the Palestinian Authority or the PLO, but also you don't have a single Palestinian faction that openly champions a one state. And I think that's very important to happen.
Not even the PFLP, the traditional Marxist secular democratic state group, they no longer support one democratic state, like Rashida.
Well, I don't want to speak on behalf of the PFLP, but I do know that many of their members are at an individual level. They tend to be some of the biggest supporters and promoters of the one-state solution, but I do not, I'm not aware of the latest literature coming from the PFLP, if indeed that they have adopted that position. I personally doubt it, but I do not want to answer in the affirmative since I haven't really checked out their latest writings in, let's say, in the last year or so.
I think they used to come very close to supporting it, but yeah. I have a sort of now a general question for both of you, and that is, well, actually they come down to three questions. So let me just ask you this. How did each of you, what was your own path to supporting ODS? I mean, were you in the past vehement? I have a couple of friends who used to support, Palestinian friends, who used to be active supporting the Oslo the thing, and they've changed their minds. And now they're active ODS supporters. For instance, or maybe you never thought that it was a good idea. I think others like Edward Said and others from the get-go, well, there was the rejectionist front in 1988. They said, no, we don't want anything to do with this. So, and of course, the other part is here, if you sort of, no, I think that's a different question. Let me just say one thing that has been brought up by somebody in the chat, and that is, does the Palestinian liberation movement need such a vision or an end game? You know, instead of just talking about Palestinian rights and, you know, like the rights in the BDS call, is there a need for some sort of political motivating vision? So, two things, sorry, your own path to these ideas and what you think about the idea of the necessity or not of having a sort of a end game, sometimes people call it.
Yeah, if I take the second point first, I absolutely believe that there has to be a vision. It's crucial. You will never get a political movement coalescing about rights and, you know, and Israel's a baddie and we have to boycott. That is not how it works. You have to have a vision, really, in every sense of that word, that you aspire to something which is not only right and just, but is actually quite noble. The idea that the oppressed people, the people who whose rights were taken from them, who were dispossessed, come back saying, look, you, the dispossessors, you, the usurpers, okay, you know, it's happened and you're here. So we're going to look at how we're going to make this thing work together. That is what I mean by a noble vision and a noble aim. Anyway, so that's the answer to that one. In terms of how I arrived at it, look, I was never ever one of the people who accepted, believed in, or agreed to the two-state solution. I'm well aware, of course, I remember 1988, and I remember the excitement of many Palestinians about that, including Edward Said, by the way, in case we run away with the idea that he was always a one democratic state person. He wasn't. So, you know, people were excited and they felt something was really happening. And I don't blame them because life had been so dreadful since 1948 and before. However, I never was on board with that, ever, because maybe because I was, as you, in your introduction, my family had to leave in 1948. My memories are of 1948. They are not of making do or any of this business. So for me, it was always quite clear that the only thing that could undo the terrible harm that had been done to us was to return us to where we were before 1948. I've never had any doubt about that. So I didn't need to have a position and then I moved to another one, and none of that. And my early writings, you know, I really believe I must be among the first people to write about the one-state solution.
Yeah.
I wrote about it in 1980. I can't remember. It's such it really was from the beginning.
Yeah, I came across your article from 1997, but maybe you even wrote something
before that.
That was a late one. Okay, good.
Absolutely. Before 1990, I was writing about it.
Well, unlike Ghada, I was a member of the confused generation, a generation that believed, and it's really like, I'm actually trying to kind of like run the memory tape in my head, and just really doesn't make any sense that we promoted the return to our villages. I was keen on going and continue to be keen on going back to Beit Daras, but at the same time, also continue to speak of a Palestinian state. How can you implement the right of return for millions of Palestinian refugees, yet accept 22% or so or less at this point of historic Palestine? Of course, it makes no sense, but it was the confusion that was really wrote by that period of the peace process and Oslo, and this argument that was made at the time that, you know, what we say in Arabic, khudh wa talib, which means take and ask for more, you know, so that was supposed to be our strategy at the time. But honestly, and I'm really not going to like do any, be bragging about this, but I was a freshman at the university, and I was one of very few students who marched through the town of Bir Zayt after the Gaza-Jericho agreement was signed, chanting against the segmentation of the Palestinian liberation, chanting against Arafat and Fatah and the PLO and so forth, and the Israeli soldiers and army came and dispersed us with, you know, rubber bullets and tear gas and so forth. And since that day, really, I have been committed to this idea that we cannot speak of, or we cannot segment our liberation or the liberation of Palestine. And I remained committed to it until today. But as I said earlier in my introduction, for me, the issue, the reason I haven't really been a one-state fighter and kind of on the front lines of the movements is just my constant worry that we do not want to evolve intellectually in a direction that does not yet register, and it's not part of the struggle of my people at home. And for someone who has done so much research and various books on people's history, and particularly the history of the Palestinian people, my aim is to advance the viewpoint of the Palestinian collective as opposed to speak on their behalf and so forth. So really that has been my greatest concern. Just very quickly, Blake, regarding the issue of rights versus solutions. I think I can tell you very briefly about the evolution of the idea itself. Why did we started speaking about rights as opposed to solutions? And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the word solution in the Palestinian political discourse has become so overwhelming and so unrealistic in the way it was presented. You know, this fight that is dissipating now, but it was a defining fight of whether it's a one-state solution or a two-state solution. And so the word solution was tossed around so very often as if really it was the matter of just finding these creative ideas that Netanyahu, or in this case Bennett, is just waiting for, and they are ready to adopt that solution that Ramzy or someone else has somewhere in the world. And I think some people kind of were fed up with that principle and that concept, and they came up with, you know what, why don't we just speak about rights and enough speaking about solutions? Because if Palestinian rights are being satisfied, well, here is your solution. Of course, I agree with Ghada. There is no liberation movement in the world that has ever achieved its rights, that went to a battle for those rights without having a vision. And no, we have to have a vision. Call it solution, call it anything else, but it is a vision, and we have to have it, we have to articulate it, we have to agree to it, and we have to gather, you know, the Palestinian people around it, because without having that as a banner, how can we possibly achieve our end goal if we don't know what the end goal is?
Wow. Thank you both. That was very impressive answers. Thank you very much. Let me just briefly get back to one point. I think when I read about ODS, some people seem to think it's a new idea. And I ran across this as a fully fledged, fully formulated concept in a statement or a long paper written in 1921, exactly 100 years ago, by the Third Palestine Arab Congress, by its executive committee. And it was a paper called Report on the State of Palestine. Of course, state, I think they meant more of the condition, you know. And they presented it to Winston Churchill in person in Jerusalem, and of course he rejected it. He was then colonial secretary. But just to say how the pedigree of this idea, it goes back to then. In the 20s, all of the Palestine Arab Congresses supported it. In the 30s, it became the Arab High Committee. And in negotiations for the White Paper in 1939, people like Jamal al-Husseini and George Antonius and Musa Alami, many others. This was the position that they presented at the St. James talks in London for a couple of months. I mean, it's very clear, including that the Jewish immigrants, the Zionist immigrants, could stay as citizens. Okay, and as you all know, in discussing the partition resolution, also the possibility of partition in the United Nations in 1947, there was this vision which was sort of binational, sort of ODS, which was the minority position, but it had support from Pakistanis, from Yugoslavia, other places, and many Palestinians were behind the scenes active in promoting that. And of course, the PLO from 1964. You both know much more about this particular history than I do, but approximately 74, they started, until in that decade, they were for the secular democratic state, it was called, a single reunited Palestine. And then they started moving toward two-state solution, which in 88 in the Declaration of Independence was then fully embraced. And now Ghada people, you probably were the main one. Other people started writing about this. And the first whole book, to my knowledge, about it is Mazin Kumsier, his book, Sharing the Land of Canaan, 2004. Excellent book. The second one, to my knowledge, was from Virginia Tilley in 2005, called, I think, One State Solution, I think it was called. The third, a year later, Ali Abunimah, One Country, the fully developed vision. And then in 2007 was your book, Ghada, Married to Another Man. And when I read these four books, when I got into this issue, I could see that, the argumentation has been done in a way. So the thing is to realize it. And there have been many conferences, ODS conferences at SOAS in London, in Boston. 2 were in Haifa, Jaffa, Zurich, Stuttgart. There have been, and each one had its own set of statements and principles. And again, a group that we would very much like to work with, the ODS campaign, has formed on the ground. And a book written by one of those members, Jeff Halper, is called Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine. I would count that as the 5th book by a single author who just deals only with, well, more or less only with ODS. So anybody looking who really wants to find out, sort of get into the academic part of it or the theoretical part of it, all of these 5 books, you could read these. Would the realization of ODS, would that mean anything to either of you personally? I don't know. I'm sort of imagining, would you move back? I don't know what, or emotionally, is this question perhaps too vague, or what would it mean to you personally for your own life if this actually happened? We're allowed to sort of wish and hope and fantasize, I guess.
All right. Look, I honestly, I can only assure you that it would be the most wonderful thing for me, from my point of view, absolutely wonderful. It would be the realization of so much effort, so much struggle, and would satisfy all kinds of yearnings, intellectual, emotional. I can't really explain how much it would mean. The idea that, which people take for granted because it's their everyday experience, the idea that you go to a country, you travel, you go to a country, and it's yours. It's yours, it's home. Whatever you might do in terms of buying a house or not buying a house, it's yours. And it's almost indescribable, the sense of satisfaction, of joy, of what can I say? I know it sounds very emotional, but it is emotional. This is how it would feel. And I've often wondered if, dear, I used to enter into a sort of a pact with death to say, I'm not prepared to die. Listen to this, I'd say. I'm not prepared to die while the state of Israel is still in existence. That would be the happiest thing to know that before one died, one's homeland would come back.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ghada. Just want to touch briefly on what Blake has spoken about, the history. It seems to me, yes, there is a very long history of a discussion regarding a shared place, a shared country, or a one state. But I want to denote that many of these solutions seem to be consistent with certain historical political realities that were prominent at the time. These realities were disrupted during the first Intifada, 1988, the declarations in Algiers, and then the Oslo peace process, when we began talking about nothing but a peace process, a one-state solution, a land for peace formula, and that sort of thing. Now, from a historical point of view, the peace process has failed. And because it has failed, then the two states automatically, which has always been linked to it, has also failed. I don't know why are we delinking it now. Those who are arguing that the peace process has failed are still the same people who are still making an argument for a two-state solution. So it's really, it's illogical, it's irrational. We are returning to the discussion on one state, a discussion that began a century ago, and it evolved through various political periods. For example, the so-called Canaanites movement in the 40s, for example, that argued for Palestinians learning Hebrew and becoming members of the same Israel-controlled state, versus the Fatah vision by the Fatah movement in the 70s. And I believe one of your readers just, or our listeners just shared a link regarding the Fatah vision for a shared future in the mid-1970s. So this is even from a political point of view. I mean, you de-alienated the intellectual history of this, but from a political point of view, the Palestinians had that vision for, starting a long time ago, but most prominently in the 60s and 70s. Now we need to talk about it, but we need to consider the political circumstances in which this discussion is taking place. We as Palestinians want to talk about it because the peace process has failed. The two-state solutions was a failure to begin with. It was this carrot dangled in front of the Palestinian masses for such a long time. It was a failure. It was a trick. It started with the likes of Henry Kissinger and others who really had no intention of ever offering Palestinians a state to begin with. We realized that we need to go back to the historical trajectory of the Palestinian political movement, Palestinian national movement, and the Palestinian intellectual movement. And that is one that advocates a shared future. This is so the one state is really not a novel idea. It is part of our history, and it's the longer part of our history.
Much longer.
But that doesn't mean, exactly, but that doesn't mean, Blake, that we are going to go with our tails between our legs telling Israel, okay, we failed in the two-state solutions, can you please give us few rights here and there? No, we have to approach this from a point of strength, because Israel has also failed. The Zionist vision has also completely shattered and failed. The Zionist warriors are now nothing but snipers lining up the horizon of the Gaza Strip, shooting at little children and killing them on a daily basis. This is the Zionist vision. They have nothing. They really are politically bankrupt. The occupation is a failure. Colonialism and apartheid are being exposed internationally as a complete disgrace and a failure, and so forth. Now we are going from a position of strength. Let's talk about a shared future, because the two-state solution and the peace process has failed, but your racist Zionist ideas of colonization and apartheid has also been a complete and utter failure. We have to find that common ground and common space, because all of these ideas that have been put forth since the 80s have been utter and a complete failure. Now, what does it mean to me? I am still in my 40s, and I am already worried about where I'm going to get buried, honestly. And I read only recently that one of the greatest poets of Gaza, Mu'in Bseiso, he died in an Egyptian hospital. And he wrote, when he was dying in the hospital, he wrote a letter to Mahmoud Darwish to work his magic with the Fatah movement, with the PLO, through their international connections, to have him buried in Gaza. He said, yesterday we fought to free Palestine, today we are fighting for a place to be buried. And now here is another generation of Palestinian intellectuals, and I am already worried about wanting to be buried in my homeland. And I mean, imagine if it means so much to us where we are going to be buried, so how much does it actually mean to us to be alive and back in our villages, in our homes, in our towns, in which we can find that sense of normality, claim it even for once in our lives. And I just one last thing, and I know many Palestinians look at those who have British citizenships and American citizenships as if they are the privileged few, but I would exchange my American passport in a heartbeat if it means that I will live the next phase of my life in my village back in Palestine.
Well, yeah. Thank you both for those statements. There's one thing. It's getting back sort of a little bit to a drier question, but is there any? We do have a few more minutes. Are there concrete steps that you think, or what would be the next steps to take to a step toward realizing ODS? Ghada, I know you have strong and clear ideas on this, and I think you expound some of them in the book that Elon and Ramzy are editing. Would you like to go into that briefly, or is that too big a discussion for now? I mean, you could make a whole webinar on that. In fact, we might. Let me just throw this in right now. This is the first webinar. We're just trying to, introduce the idea here on ODS. We want to do many more in Arabic and in Hebrew and in English, with involving our members and others who are not members. And so we could possibly do a separate webinar on just that. Okay, this is the vision. Is there like 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps? Is there anything that we can actually do?
Can I just agree with you that I think the way forward that I have imagined is something that is it's not the appropriate time to talk about it. I hope that there would be a future occasion, and I'm happy to do that.
Good.
I think the next step is to make the conversation more inclusive, and to unify our ranks as intellectuals, activists, historians, and try to kind of create this rounded idea of what that vision for a Palestinian future is, and then push for that at a political level within various Palestinian political groups. We can't pretend that we can exist separate from Fatah and Hamas and the Popular Front and the Democratic Front. They are the people who are, who represent the Palestinians on the ground. And I wouldn't vote for Fatah, but it has a great deal of support on the ground. I mean, that's the reality of it. We have to engage these movements and these political parties, and until we reach a point that we push this from the grassroots all the way to the helm, where the Palestinian a democratically elected and truly representative Palestinian leadership adopts the idea of the one state. I don't know when this will happen. Political circumstances are moving very quickly and very fast on the ground, that I wouldn't be shocked if this is only the matter of few years before we abandon all illusions and embrace the reality and embrace a better vision for an independent Palestine. But I definitely think that the starting point of all of this is to make the conversation more inclusive and to take the discussion to the Islamic University, Al-Azhar University in Gaza, to the Birzeit University, Bethlehem University, get young people involved in that discussion, link them with other Palestinians, especially the youth in various Arab communities in today's Israel, and so forth, until that there is a strong enough foundation that can fight for that idea and make it a reality one day.
Yeah, I entirely agree with that. That's absolutely right.
Ramzy, when you talk about the Palestinian leadership and having, moving the political parties in this direction and electing a new leadership, you are talking only about the West Bank and Gaza Strip, I guess. I mean, that's the only that's the only polity that's organized in a way that could actually, to my knowledge, there's no way that all Palestinians everywhere can now vote for a new PNC or PLO leadership. Is that?
Of course, and this is ultimate. This is our fight, Blake. The fight is to I do not have any illusions that the PLO, even during its prime, was a true representatives of all Palestinians. But also, you have to deal with the fact that we are a liberation movement, or we ought to be, not in the views of Mahmoud Abbas, but we ought to behave as a liberation movement. And liberation movements cannot possibly provide this perfectly democratic and representative reality while you are, fighting underground and fighting from tunnels in Gaza. But we want to have as representative and democratic foundation for our political visions as much as possible. And the only way of doing that is definitely not the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. These are, the corrupt elites that have benefited and became rich at the expense of most Palestinians. And they are the last people who should be serving as an ally for the Palestinian people. What we would like to see is an elections within the PLO, the return to the centrality of the Palestine Liberation Organization, an inclusive PLO that brings Hamas and brings the Islamic Jihad and brings the socialists and everybody together and do the best we can in order for us to revive it and making it that platform in which we Palestinians can communicate all the way from Seattle to London to Ain al-Hilwi to Jabalia and to Khan Yunis.
Yeah,
I think we've run our time. If either of you would like to say anything else, do, but otherwise, I guess not really. Thank you very much. Yeah, and again, I hope we can do many more webinars, perhaps with you. And, okay, all the best to you both, and to our participants.
Thank you.
Thanks for.
Thank you very much, Blake, for organizing this and for all the wonderful people who have joined us today. And thank you very much, Ghada. Learned so much from you today.
That's true.
Likewise. I echo that. I second it.
Okay. Okay. Well, we can watch ourselves on YouTube pretty soon. We're going to post it. Okay. I guess I'll push this little button down here that says "Be ended." Thank you again. Bye bye.
Cheers.